The snow on the windshield was relentless, fighting against the wipers as I navigated the winding coastal roads of Maine. It was Christmas Eve, and I was exhausted. Deployment fatigue still lived in my bones, a constant hum beneath the surface, but the thought of the cliffside manor kept me going. Home, or at least the idea of it. My phone buzzed on the center console. Angela, not Mom. Just Angela, I answered, expecting warmth, maybe a question about my arrival time. Instead, her voice was sharp, efficient. Savannah, don't come to the house. We rented your room out. Premium tourists offered triple the rate for the holiday week. You understand, right? We need the cash flow. Find a motel in town. The line went dead before I could speak. I pulled over onto the icy shoulder, the engine idling in the silence. No apology, no hesitation, just eviction by voicemail. Before I tell you what I did next, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's standing watch with me tonight. I sat there in the silence of the car, the engine's warmth the only thing separating me from the freezing Maine winter. My mother's words echoed in my ears. Not a request, but a command, a dismissal. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Tears are a tactical liability I gave up somewhere between basic training and my third tour. Instead, my Navy training kicked in. Assess the situation, identify the threat, formulate a response. I reached for the glove box. Inside was a thick manila envelope I kept with me everywhere, a habit born of a life spent in transit. I pulled it out and flipped it open. There it was, the deed, my name, Savannah Miller, printed clearly as the sole owner of the Cliffside Manor. I traced the letters with my thumb. This wasn't just paper, it was my leverage, my proof. I looked at my phone again. I pulled up the listing on the rental site. Historic Cliffside Manor Holiday Special. The photos were beautiful, showcasing the roaring fireplaces and the ocean views. My views, my fireplaces. And there in the description, managed by the Miller family. The audacity was breathtaking. They were selling my property, my sanctuary, to strangers for cash while I sat on the side of the road. I didn't turn around. I didn't drive to the Motel 6. I put the car in gear and drove past the manor. The windows were glowing with warmth, cars I didn't recognize filling the driveway. I saw shadows moving inside, laughter spilling out into the night. It looked perfect. It looked like a lie. I drove another 10 miles down the coast to a rental I knew, an old lighthouse keeper cottage that had been converted into a vacation rental. It was small, isolated, and sturdy. A watchtower. I checked in, the key heavy in my hand. Inside it was cold, but it was mine for the night. I poured a glass of whiskey, neat, and sat by the window, watching the snow swirl over the dark ocean. I wasn't retreating, I was repositioning. The siege had begun. I took a sip of the whiskey, the burn settling deep in my chest, and opened the file again. The paper was 6 years old, slightly yellowed at the edges, but the legal seal was crisp. It was the history of my servitude, printed in black and white. 6 years ago, my father Richard and my brother Nathan had decided they were financial geniuses. They had leveraged the family estate on a sure-thing crypto investment that evaporated overnight. They didn't just lose their savings, they lost everything. The Cliffside Manor, which had been in our family for 3 generations, was days away from a foreclosure auction. I was 23 then, fresh out of officer candidate school, proud and naive. Richard had sat me down, tears in his eyes, the only time I had ever seen him cry, and begged. He could not get a loan. His credit was radioactive. But I was clean. I was military. I had access to the VA home loan benefit. It was their only way out. So, I stepped in. I secured a $450,000 loan with zero down payment thanks to my service. But the bank had one non-negotiable condition. My father's name had to come off the title. He was a liability. To save the house, the deed had to be transferred solely to me. I remember the day we signed. Richard could not look at me. He signed the quitclaim deed with a shaking hand. His ego bruised, but his lifestyle saved. I thought I was being a hero. I thought I was buying their respect. Since that day, I have sent them $2,400 every single month. They called it maintenance. I called it rent, though I never said that out loud. I paid the mortgage, the insurance, the taxes. I kept the roof over their heads while I slept in bunks on aircraft carriers. Sitting there in the lighthouse, watching the snow bury the world outside, I asked myself the question that had haunted me for years. Why? Why did I keep paying? Why did I let them treat me like an ATM while they treated Nathan like a prince? There is a term for it in behavioral psychology. We used it in intelligence training to understand how to break assets, how to keep them loyal even when you are starving them. It is called intermittent reinforcement. It is the same psychological mechanism that makes gambling addictive. If a slot machine never paid out, you would walk away in 5 minutes. If it paid out every time, you would get bored. But if it pays out randomly, just once every 100 pulls, you will sit there until you starve, pulling that lever, desperate for the dopamine hit of the win. That was my relationship with my family. 90% of the time, they were cold, critical, or indifferent. But then there would be that 10%. A birthday card signed, "Love, Dad." A moment where my mother bragged about my rank to a neighbor while I was standing there. A holiday dinner where nobody fought. Let me explain. Those rare, unpredictable crumbs of affection were my jackpot. They kept me at the machine, feeding it $2,400 a month, pulling the lever, waiting for the next win. I had convinced myself that if I just paid enough, if I just achieved enough, the payout would become permanent. But tonight, the casino was closed. The realization washed over me, colder than the Atlantic wind rattling the windanes. It wasn't love, it was conditioning. They hadn't kept me around because they cared. They kept me around because I was the only one paying the bills. I looked down at the deed one last time. I wasn't just the player anymore. I owned the house, and it was time to change the odds. My silence was apparently louder than any scream. By the next morning, my family realized I wasn't at the Motel 6. They started pinging my phone, first with irritation, then with something darker. Angela texted, "You're being dramatic. Stop punishing us." Nathan left a voicemail, his voice thick with entitlement. "You're risking my investment here, Savannah. These people expect a certain vibe. Don't make this weird." Simultaneously, my Facebook feed lit up. Angela had posted a photo album titled "Holiday Magic at the Manor." There they were, my parents and Nathan, smiling in front of the fireplace I paid to sweep, holding mugs of cocoa I paid for, surrounded by strangers who were paying them to be there. The caption read, "So blessed to share our historic home with new friends. Family is everything." The juxtaposition was nauseating. The private cruelty versus the public sainthood. It erased any lingering flicker of guilt I might have felt. They weren't just renting out rooms. They were renting out a fantasy of a life they hadn't earned, funded by the daughter they had discarded. I closed the app. I didn't engage. I didn't comment. I dialed a number hadn't used in years. Mr. Sterling. He was the family attorney who had handled the original deed transfer. a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried because he had helped dig the holes. "Savannah," he answered, surprised. "Is everything all right?" "No, Mr. Sterling. I need to retain you officially. I'm executing my rights as the sole owner of the Cliffside Manor. I need to evict squatters." There was a long pause on the other end. "Squatters? Who?" "My parents." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't shocked. He knew. He had always known. "Meet me at the diner in town in an hour," he said. "Bring the deed." I hung up and looked out at the gray ocean. The gaslighting campaign had failed. They wanted me to feel crazy, ungrateful, small. Instead, they had just handed me the ammunition I needed to end the war. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was the plaintiff. Mr. Sterling met me at the diner, a relic of a place that smelled of old coffee and frying bacon. He looked exactly the same as he had 6 years ago. Worn suit, tired eyes, sharp mind. He didn't ask how I was. He just asked for the file. I slid the intel packet across the table. It contained everything. The original deed, 6 years of bank transfer receipts showing my monthly payments, and the screenshots of the current rental listing. He reviewed them in silence, his brow furrowing. "This is clean," he said finally. "Legally, they are guests at will. You can revoke that at any time. But Savannah, eviction is ugly, especially family." "They aren't family right now," I said, my voice steady. "They are liabilities." I told him I wanted to check the property records before we moved forward. I wanted to know exactly what I was walking into. "I've been sending extra money for repairs," I explained. "Roof work, structural maintenance. I want to see the permits." Sterling pulled up the county database on his laptop, scrolled, clicked, then stopped. His face went pale. "Savannah," he said slowly, "there are no permits for roof repairs." "What? But there is a permit application here from 2 years ago." He turned the screen toward me. It was a grant application, a $60,000 historic preservation grant. The applicant was listed as Savannah Miller. The status was approved and dispersed. I stared at the screen. I had never applied for a grant. I scanned the document. My signature was there at the bottom, a clumsy forgery, but passable if you didn't look too closely. And attached to the application were copies of my military service records. The room seemed to tilt. They hadn't just taken my monthly checks. They had used my identity, my service, my name to defraud a government program. The grant was for veteran-owned historic properties, Sterling read, his voice tight. Funds to be used exclusively for structural preservation. I felt a cold fury rising in my throat, replacing the last dregs of sadness. "I'm going to the house," I said, standing up. "I need to see that roof." I drove to the cliff overlooking the manor. Using my binoculars, I scanned the slate roof. It was patchy, missing tiles, clearly untouched for decades. The money wasn't on the roof. It was gone. Nathan's debts, Richard's lifestyle, Angela's image. They had stolen $60,000 in my name. This wasn't a civil dispute anymore. This was a felony. This was stolen valor fraud. I lowered the binoculars. The last bridge back to them had just collapsed under the weight of their crime. I picked up my phone and called the sheriff's non-emergency line. I wasn't just evicting them. I was reporting a crime in progress. I timed my arrival for 6 o'clock. The holiday party was in full swing. The driveway was packed with rental cars. I parked my modest sedan right behind Richard's least luxury SUV, blocking him in. I stepped out. I wasn't wearing my holiday best. I was wearing my field coat and boots, and I carried the thick file of evidence like a weapon. The sheriff pulled up seconds later, lights silent but present. I walked to the front door and let myself in. The code hadn't changed in 6 years. Inside, the foyer smelled of cinnamon and expensive wine. A dozen strangers, the premium tourists, were mingling, holding crystal glasses. Richard was holding court by the fireplace, wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car. He saw me and his smile vanished. He hurried over, his voice a hissed whisper. "Savannah, what are you doing? We have guests. Go to the kitchen." I didn't lower my voice. I raised it. "I am not going to the kitchen. Richard, I am going to address my tenants." The room went silent. The tourists looked confused. Angela rushed in from the dining room, her face a mask of panic. "Savannah, please don't ruin this." "I'm not ruining anything," I said, projecting my voice so every person in the room could hear. "I am Savannah Miller. I am the sole legal owner of this property, and I am informing every guest here that you have been victims of a rental scam. This couple has no legal right to lease this home." Chaos erupted. The tourists started murmuring, looking at their phones. Richard turned purple. "You ungrateful little traitor," he screamed, abandoning the facade. "This is my house. I built this life. How dare you try to throw us out in the snow?" "It's not your house," I said, calm and lethal. "It's my asset and you've been bleeding it dry. I did what I had to do." Richard shouted, spitfing. "I spent that grant money to save this family, to pay Nathan's debt so he wouldn't go to jail. You owe us that." The room froze. He had said it. He had confessed to the grant fraud in front of 12 witnesses and a sheriff standing in the doorway. I looked at the sheriff. He nodded once. The handcuffs came out. Angela screamed, collapsing onto the velvet sofa she didn't own. Richard was read his rights in the middle of the foyer, under the garland I used to hang as a child. He looked at me with pure hatred, but all I saw was a man who had gambled his daughter's love and lost. "Everybody out," I said to the room. "The party is over." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. It was clean. The tourists were gone, refunded by the rental platform after I submitted the fraud report. Richard was in county lockup awaiting bail. Angela and Nathan were staying with a neighbor banned from the property. It was a beautiful house. The wood paneling gleamed. The ocean view was spectacular. But as I walked from room to room, listening to the wind rattle the old frames, I realized something profound. I didn't want it. For years, I thought this house was the prize. I thought if I could just own it, control it, I would finally feel safe. I would finally have a home. But standing there, I realized I was fighting for a pile of wood and stone. The home I wanted, the feeling of safety, of belonging, had never existed here. This house was a museum of my obligation. It was a monument to the girl who thought she had to buy her way into her own family. I called Mr. Sterling the next morning. "List it," I said. "Sell it as is, roof damage and all." The sale closed 2 months later. The market was hot, and despite the repairs needed, it sold for a profit. I used the proceeds to pay back the $60,000 grant in full, clearing my name. The rest of the money, the profit that Richard had killed for, I didn't keep. I donated every cent to a charity that builds tiny homes for homeless veterans. I went back to the lighthouse rental one last time before deploying again. I sat on the deck watching the winter storm roll out to sea. I didn't have a manor. I didn't have a family estate. I didn't have parents I could call. But I had my name. I had my integrity. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a payout that was never coming. I had cashed out, and I was free. If you have ever had to walk away from a place you love to find the peace you deserved, share this story.